Hi guys, I'm here today to talk about the young adult books that I read in 2019. So if you've watched my channel for any length of time, you know that I don't usually read YA books. I maybe read like one a year and it just is something, I'm not drawn to YA books. When I first started this channel, God, I don't even know how many years ago it was now, maybe 7, maybe more, I tried to read YA because at the time that was predominantly what BookTube was, and even now the vast majority of BookTube is YA, although when you become, I guess, as insular as I do in my viewing habits, and I'm sure some of you guys do, you don't really realise how dominant YA is on BookTube because you just subscribe to channels that read what you read, and if that isn't YA you never see it. But when you sort of step outside that bubble you realise that, God, we're like 15% and everyone else is like much younger people reading YA, which makes sense because as a website, the YouTube demographic, I think the biggest demographic is like 14 to 17 year olds, so it makes complete sense that in every category the videos that are designed to be watched for teenagers, or by teenagers, sorry, are the most popular. It makes complete sense. So when I first joined BookTube, I saw loads more YA booktubers or people talking about YA books, and it just wasn't as common to hear recommendations for adult books. And so I gave YA a go and I read a few and I just didn't enjoy it. At the time I was about 22 and I just, it didn't work for me. I just thought that compared to like literary fiction, which is what I tended to read more often, or like adult fantasy, I just didn't really see why I'd choose to read YA over that. So I pretty much stopped reading YA, and every now and again like a book would take my interest and I might pick it up, but it was really uncommon. So this year I have started to use my library more, particularly towards the end of the year, and I think by using my library I've become much more willing to try books I'm not 100% sure I like, and that's because I'm not having to spend any of my own money on them. I can just borrow them, I can get them home, I can read 10 pages, and if I'm like, this is garbage, it doesn't matter. I've still supported my library, okay, I've got to carry them back, but that's not a big deal. And so it's given me much more opportunity to try more YA and I guess more genre fiction, just things that I'm not as confident will be the sort of things that I will love and therefore don't want to risk spending a lot of money on. So as well as trying more books from the library, I also got into reading Holly Black's new trilogy. Towards the end of 2018 I decided to pick The Cruel Prince up because I used to read Holly Black when I was a teenager myself, and so I thought, oh, you know, I might give that a go. And actually I had loads of issues with it, but I devoured it. I really enjoyed it, and then this year I subsequently picked up the second and the third book and again, you know, sped through them, and reading those also made me think, maybe I'd like to give YA more of a go. So I ended up reading 13 YA books, and I think 7 of those were YA fantasy, and the other 6 were, just hit my chin, YA contemporary. And that's uneven compared to my adult reading. My adult reading is much more dominated by like literary fiction, like I guess comparable to contemporary. I don't tend to read that much fantasy in my adult reading, and I think a big reason for that is, I think I mentioned this in a recent video, I do think that one thing that YA fantasy is doing particularly well is having loads of female heroines. Now I haven't read enough YA fantasy to know whether they're being done well, but it is very clear that the market have realised that that sells, and so they are buying a shit ton of books that are fantasy with a female lead they can stick on the cover and give some sort of sassy ability because it sells. Now, okay, marketing's always a little bit annoying because I feel like it's a little bit manipulative. However, it's a great thing that we're seeing more female-led fantasy, and it's a great thing that we're just seeing more female characters in fantasy in general, like, you know, like not even just the protagonists, but way more females with more than just their boobs mentioned, or a sexual assault scene in fantasy. That's quite uncommon in adult fantasy. If you don't know, it's quite depressing. And so I'm hoping that that will lead to there being more female-led adult fantasy in like 10 years. Surely it's going to trickle down. As some of these readers decide they also want to try adult fiction as they age, they're going to be like, where's all the women in adult fantasy? And then that sort of thing will start to sell well as well. So that's one thing that I have noticed about and YA fantasy, and that makes me really happy, and I hope it has a positive impact on adult fantasy in the future. So, my thoughts, so mixed. So, okay, I think what I've realised, so let's go through the 7 fantasy books first, because I think they're the ones I feel the most conflicted about. So the fantasy, firstly I mentioned the Holly Black books. So this year I read The Wicked King and The Queen of Nothing by Holly Black. I was kindly sent both of those from the publisher, but in all honesty I was so you know, enraptured by my reading experience of The Cruel Prince. I probably would have pre-ordered both of these and you know, read them myself if they hadn't been given to me for free. So I think that's a really positive thing, you know, that I was obviously interested in them. I also, I'm not going to even discuss the star ratings yet, because I have given all of these star ratings on Goodreads, but I am someone who goes back and changes my star ratings, and I'm really unsure about the star ratings on the majority of these. And in fact, I'm thinking about removing star ratings for the majority of them, which I'll discuss more in this video. Another one I read was The Raven Boys by Maggie Stiefvater. I really didn't enjoy it. I thought it was bloody awful. I listened to an audiobook, got to the end, and I just think it was a mess of a book, and I will not be carrying on with the series or picking up any of our other books. Awful. Then I also read The Deathless Girls. I actually read this a few days before Christmas. I think I started it right before Christmas and then maybe finished it like Boxing Day. So I'll talk about this more in my December wrap up, but I ended up not enjoying this very much. I wouldn't really recommend it. I think it had merits. Some of the writing style was pretty good, but I think it had, the first 2/3 was fairly strong. The final section was awful, really rushed, and it made no sense. And I think it was just, I've got a bit of cat fluff on me. I think it was just, the last section, it was very obvious that she had like, the story of Dracula's Bride to follow, and she was like, how can I get this story I've built up to fit that, and how can I do it in 30 pages? And yeah, it was a bit of a mess. Then more fluff on me, it's ridiculous. I decided to pick up, what is it? An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. And I got a copy of that from the library, and that's because I'd heard quite a lot of people compare that to Holly Black's books, and I realised that I really enjoyed reading those because, as I said, I read Holly Black as a teenager, and I read other books like that as a teenager, and it just gave me lots of nostalgia for being that age and loving those sort of books. And so I wanted to give more books like that a go. So with that one, again, I read it in December, so I'll talk about it in my December wrap up. I, again, sped through it. I read, the majority of these books were read in like maybe 2 sittings, but loads of them would have been read in a day. So I sped through it. I thought her writing style was brilliant. I thought that in part her writing style was stronger than Holly Black's. She took a little bit more time, but the same with The Deathless Girls. I actually felt that it was a fairly strong book that needed about 100 more pages at the end, and the end really let it fall down, because the last 30 pages was just like whiplash. It just felt like she needed to finish the story. She didn't really understand how she was going to do it. She couldn't really make the plot work, and so she just wrote a few words and hoped it explained loads of unexplainable stuff away, and hoped for the best. And I also found, which I found with a lot of these YA fantasy books, that you get really pulled into the romance whilst you're reading them, and you get really swept up in it, and then pretty much as soon as you finished, this is how I feel with them, with the ones that I've read, I'm then like, God, that romance wasn't that strong actually. There was no real chemistry. Both those characters were really poorly developed. That didn't make any sense. And now that heady rush of me wanting to know what happens has gone, I've realised that it was all pretty empty. So that's like pretty strongly how I felt with the whole Holly Black trilogy and with the first Margaret Rogerson book I just mentioned. So once I finished that one, I had a little look and I realised, oh, this fluff is not going away. I had a little look and I realised on Goodreads that first Margaret Rogerson one had actually got quite low ratings, but that her newest book had quite high ratings. And so I thought, you know what, whilst I had a big issue with the ending, I actually really enjoyed reading it in like one sitting, and so I really want her other book. So I bought myself Sorcery of Thorns. I love these covers, by the way, I think they're brilliant. And again, I read this in like 1 or 2 sittings in the evenings after work, and I really enjoyed it. This is a much stronger book. This isn't as much like Holly Black. It's, I don't really know how you describe it. She's sort of built her own world in which people work in libraries, but libraries have, the books have their own minds and their own magic, and the people who work in the libraries believe that these men who are wizards are sort of evil and against the church. And so they're protecting the libraries from these men while still needing these men. And we follow our main character who gets involved with one of these wizards because she's accused of something we know she didn't do. And yeah, again, really enjoyed this one. I thought it was a much stronger book, the romance was much more believable, and the plot made more sense. But I still finished that and was initially like, yeah, I'm going to give that 4 stars. Like, I really enjoyed that. And then within a week was like, pretty forgettable, like, and actually there wasn't that much romance there. I wanted much more romance, and it was just a bit too like convenient at points, and yeah, it just felt a little bit like by it. So I think that's my thing with YA fantasy more than with YA contemporary. I found with the ones that I've read, even with the ones I've enjoyed, that I get this moment where I'm reading them and I cannot put them down, and I just I pick them up whilst I walk to the kitchen and get a more drink, which I'd never do with any of the adult books I read. Maybe epic fantasy, but usually not with anything else. I pick it up even when I go to the kitchen. I will say no to like any other activity in order to read the book and to finish it. And I'm desperate to know what's going to happen, and it reminds me so much of being a teenager. So that's one thing I really loved about it. It's that heady rush of really wanting to finish a book, really wanting to know what happens, and the nostalgia. Those 2 things are wonderful. However, it's like eating a massive bowl of sweets, right? In the moment, you're loving it, and you're loving the smell of the sweets, and you're loving all the sugar rush, and they all taste delicious. And then afterwards, your teeth ache, and you've not really got anything out of it, and within a few days, you know, you probably wouldn't go through it again. Like, you're going to need a little bit of time to forget it. So, yeah, that's how I feel. Now, I'm sure there's some YA fantasy out there that would be super readable, super fun, as well as really memorable and brilliant. But I don't think I found it yet. Even in this one, which I think actually is significantly better than the Holly Black books, because I actually think the Holly Black books, and particularly the 2nd and the 3rd, are a mess of plot, and actually the main character makes no fucking sense. Any of her decisions don't make sense. But so yeah, this is why I find it impossible to rate these books, and why I'm thinking about just not rating them on Goodreads, because do I rate them based on my enjoyment, which would be high? Like, in the moment, all of these would be like 4-star enjoyment. I wouldn't go so far as 5 because, you know, but 4-star enjoyment, I'd be like, oh my god, this is brilliant. But actually, after I walk away, loads of these would be like 2-star on like an actual me taking an objective perspective and saying, no, is this actually good? Does this have literary merit? Not really. There's lots of issues with these books. So there's those ones. So for the contemporary books, I only have 2 that I haven't actually got my own copies of. One is Eliza and Her Monsters by Francesca Zappia. I read that in November, so I recently reviewed it, so I'll link that video up here. And I quite enjoyed that one. I probably would have given it closer to 4 stars if the ending hadn't disappointed me so much. And then I also read The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. I really enjoyed that book, but I found some of it a little bit like a little bit cliched. I found that I thought the idea was brilliant, but it wasn't brilliantly written and executed. And a part of the plot for me pretty much knocked a whole star off, which is that the main character has a brother who has a different mother, and that mother is with a man who we know is sort of like a gang lord, and I thought that was like such a complex issue to handle so lightly, and I thought that was just really underdeveloped and didn't have the space it needed. I think the book would have been stronger without that added element. If it hadn't been for that, I would have given it 4 stars. So now we're on to the 4 best YA books I read in 2019. These are all YA contemporary, and I gave all of them, I think actually I gave one of them 3 stars, which seems a little bit harsh because I did really enjoy it, but I'm a harsh bitch. So I enjoyed all of these, and I think they're all stronger books than the aforementioned YA fantasy. So I'll start from the one I gave the lowest rating, and this is Emergency Contact by Mary H.K. Choi. So this actually hasn't got like very high ratings on Goodreads for YA books. Heads up, YA books get insanely high ratings, as does loads of genre fiction. So I don't know, I just feel like literary fiction is much more cruelly rated, which makes sense because I'm the sort of person who rates literary fiction, and as I said, I'm a bitch. So I really enjoyed this, and actually I think I probably should have given it 4 stars because I just found it a pleasure to read. I looked at reviews afterwards because I was surprised that it had such a, you know, comparatively low rating, and loads of people said they really didn't like the main character and they thought she was really selfish. I actually didn't see that, and I thought that she was fairly like representative of her age, and I don't know, I just didn't think she was that big a bitch. Maybe that was because I was a little bit, well, I was probably quite conceited and pretentious when I was her age. I'm a bit still now, so I related to her quite a bit. So maybe it's just that, you know, I just saw myself in her. So when other people are like, bitch, I didn't like her, I'm writing it down, I was like, woo. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. I thought the characters were great, and it's just really readable. She has a new book out now, which I didn't realise until a few days ago, and I just bought myself it. So that's obviously, you know, a good recommendation because I decided I want to own this one still and also own her next one. Then I would say the next one is The Burning by Laura Bates. This gave me so much nostalgia for the sort of books I read when I was a teen. Now, I think some of my favourite books as a teenager were not good books. They're out of print now. I'm sure they're absolutely bloody awful. I read loads of Kate Can, and I don't even know names of the other authors I read, but they were bad. But this is the sort of thing that I would have like loved as a teenager, and I really recognised that as an adult reader, and it gave me so much nostalgia. You probably know about this. This is like a YA contemporary where a girl is sort of slut-shamed at her school, and so she moves to a new school in Scotland with her mother and tries to hide her identity and like what happened previously. And then she also starts a new history project at the school, and she decides to do research into witches. And there's a slight magical element to this book, but it's mainly a YA contemporary. I really enjoyed this because I like when within YA the pace is slowed down enough so that you can have somebody walk to go get chips from the chippy, and have a little countryside walk and tell you about what their home smells like and what their mother's like as a person. Like, I enjoy that, and I think she did that. Again, I think the ending was a bit rushed. I'd pretty much say this for every single one of these YA books. I think a real issue for me is that the endings are rushed. But I probably would have given this book 5 stars if the ending had just been a bit stronger. But I think this, and again, you know, this lacked a little bit of subtlety and tact, and again, I think that's because of the audience it's aimed at. It's trying to like hit you over the head with things, which I think is forgivable because I probably would have needed that as a 14-year-old reading this. I guess I don't now, which means I'm then like a little bit like eye-rolly. I know, you didn't need to sort of spell it out for me, but I get why that's done for the readers that it's aimed at. So I really enjoyed this one. The next one is We Are Okay by Nina LaCour. Beautiful cover, and a beautiful book as well. This is about a girl who's just starting university, or college as you'd call it, because this is based in the US, and her grandfather has recently died, and he was raising her because years before her mother had died, and she left quite quickly, and a best friend that she was incredibly close to, and they haven't spoken in a long time, and she's really isolating herself, and it's about the few days over Christmas break when everybody else leaves the dorms and she stays behind because she's got nowhere and nobody to go to, and what happens during that Christmas break. So this is really slow, it's really thoughtful. I think it's very sensitively done, and it doesn't rush anything, and I, for such a depressing topic, I didn't feel depressed. Like, it was uplifting. It had lots of moments of joy and beauty, and her memories that she had of people, and the friendships she had. So yeah, I really enjoyed this, and I just got one of her other books for Christmas and will be reading it soon. And again, I'd follow her and read whatever she brought out. And then my favourite YA book of the whole year, this is the one I really ummed and ahed about giving 5 stars and putting in my favourite books of the year. And again, if the ending had been given For this one, even just like 20 more pages, this would have been a brilliant book, but I just think it was just a bit too rushed. This is the Miseducation of Cameron Post. Again, this hasn't got brilliant ratings on Goodreads, and I think a really big reason for that is because it's quite a slow YA book. It's about 470 pages, fairly small font, and you really do follow this character's life. And I think a lot of YA readers, based on all these YA books I've read, the pacing, this is an outlier, and the pacing in the majority of YA, I think, is very quick. And so when you're asked to read a 470 page book about this young girl's life, where you get told things about like her going to do like lifeguarding, and when she, like, what the hot dog stall smells like, and what film she's watching in her bedroom obsessively over the summer. I think in other YA books you wouldn't get those details, you just keep getting plot, 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 and that isn't what happens here. I loved this, I thought it was absolutely brilliant. This book is sold as being about a young girl who, her parents die when she's quite young, and she's looked after by her aunt and her grandma, and they find out that she is gay, and they send her away to a camp to be straightened, and you follow her story from there. Now, you're told that in the blurb, and that's what everyone says when they describe this book, but actually that doesn't happen until quite a significant portion of the way through the book. The first half is like her life before any of her family realised that she may be gay, and I think that was the stronger half. I think the descriptions of her small town were brilliant. The dialogue between her and her family was excellent. I just love slice of life, and this really felt like that. I still enjoyed the second half, but I don't think it was anywhere near as strong as the first half. The reason I think that is because I think that the author has probably used a lot of her life to inform the first half. I'm not sure if she has, you know, I don't know enough about her life to whether it informs the second half, but it felt, the first half felt more authentic to me and better realised. And as I said, I just felt the ending was a tiny bit rushed. I think the film for this is great, but I watched it just after reading the book. The film pretty much just focuses on the second half. And I actually think if you haven't read the book, then the film lacks depth. But if you've read the book and then you watch the film, you'll probably really enjoy it, as I did. So this was the best YA book I read all year. So if you have read, you know, YA like this, please, please, please recommend me it. One thing I'll say is that loads of people recommended me The Astonishing Colour of After by Emily XR Pan. I tried it, I really didn't like it. I really didn't like the writing style. I thought it jumped around a bit. I thought the character didn't really make sense. So that one wasn't for me, but please feel free to recommend me other books. So I guess, like, my thoughts, sorry I sound like so like weird and croaky, but I just can't get rid of it. I keep trying to cough and it's just not working. So I think my thoughts are really split between the fantasy and the contemporary. Okay, as I said, the fantasy feels like a bit of a candy rush. I read it really quickly, like even quicker than the contemporary. I just cannot put it down. But I feel like there's way more room for error in YA fantasy. I feel like to build a whole world, to usually include a romance, and then to add plot to that, and to try and make it, you know, beautifully written. A lot of these YA fantasy that I've been picking up tend to be ones that are quite lyrical. It doesn't tend to be something that a lot of these authors can do, from my experience of the limited amount I've read in 2019. Again, please feel free to recommend me books if you think there's books that lie outside of that framework. But, you know, Holly Black, she can do beautiful descriptions of food, of clothes, of castles. She cannot, from my experience, write characters' motivations well. Her characters don't make sense, her plot doesn't really make sense, it's really rushed. The same can be said for Margaret Rogerson. I think she's better, but I think her characters aren't developed enough, and I think her plot is usually a bit nonsensical towards the end of her stories. I'll continue to read a YA fantasy. I'm going to try and, you know, be more selective and hopefully get some recommendations from you guys. So even though I'm not like really raving about them, I've really enjoyed the experience. And also, one thing I'll say for all of these books is that I've really recognised that maybe this is something I need. I have got out of the habit of reading adult fantasy because, like I said, it's really hard to find good adult fantasy out there that's well written, with strong female characters that aren't always sexually assaulted, and not super fast paced. That's really hard to find in adult fantasy. And so I don't read much genre fiction. I read a lot of like heavy, slow books. And actually these books have palette cleansers in between to make me feel like I'm reading more. It has been lovely and I've really enjoyed that experience. And YA contemporary, I've really enjoyed all these. You know, I still don't think that writing style wise these would stand up against some of the best adult contemporary books I've read this year. But they're different types of books. I've really enjoyed them, and I've really enjoyed reading books that have given me loads of nostalgia for being a teenager and for the books I used to read as a teenager. But all this to say, and this is a really long video, I'm never going to enjoy YA as much as I enjoy adult fiction. I just think adult fiction has way more to offer. Yeah, it is, personally, for what I like, I just think it has more depth and the writing style is better. But I enjoy YA for what it is, although I think there's significant room for improvement in YA fantasy. Bearing in mind that Holly Black is one of the most celebrated YA fantasy authors at the moment, and fucking hell, like, why doesn't her editor just say, look Holly, this plot don't make sense, like, you need to spend more time on this. No, we're not publishing this. But of course they'll publish it because they've got Holly Black on their book list and they know they're going to make a shit ton of money. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Please feel free to recommend me books. As I said, I would love recommendations of books like these, and also you know, stuff like this that's very shiny, that's done a bit with basically this with more romance, like a stronger romance, and with a bit of a stronger plot would be excellent. And another thing I would like to say that I've realised is that I think I do miss reading romance. Like, I guess I probably stopped reading any books that had a significant romance plot since I was a teenager, and I've really enjoyed Juliet Marillier the last year or so, and she always has a sort of big romance storyline in her books, and all these YAs I think nearly all have a romance involved, and I've really enjoyed that. And so I want to try and maybe incorporate some adult romance into my reading, which loads more people have been doing recently, so there's so many amazing recommendations out there. But again, feel free to give me some more down below. So yeah, those are my very garbled thoughts, but let me know what you think. Let me know if you've read any of these books I've mentioned, and like I said, would love some recommendations, and would love to hear your experiences. Do you read a lot of YA? What are your reasons for reading YA? And what are your reasons for not, if you don't read YA? And another thing that I'd just like to say that I just find interesting is sometimes when I do watch people who read YA and non-YA, and I also do watch some people who just read YA because, you know, I've been getting more into it this year, and people in the comments are always like, oh my god, how did you read 25 books this month? And fucking hell, now it makes sense, because it's way quicker to read one of those than it is to read an adult book. It just is. And I guess maybe that can't be said for like genre fiction, I don't know. I know I read fantasy way quicker than I read literary fiction. It could take me the same amount of time to read an 800-page fantasy as it does to read a 400-page literary fiction. But it makes sense now, because if I decided to do a whole month of YA, then yeah, you could, if you wanted to spend the time on it, they're so compelling to want to know what happens next that you could easily just be like, right, I'm going to read one a fucking day. So yeah, that was just something I noticed that I thought was interesting, because before I've been like, if people work full time, how do they read 25 books in a month? But I guess when they're that readable and there's that much plot, you just want to know what's going to happen next. So it makes sense to me now. So yeah, those are my thoughts. This was way longer than I expected, but I'm going to upload this on like New Year's Eve. So wherever you are in the world, Happy New Year if you're already in the new year. And if you're not, I hope you have a lovely New Year's Eve. I'll be staying in and reading, because why would I do anything else? And yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.